A new report highlighting security failures in the Parkland school massacre.
Now, this as chilling images emerge of the accused shooter inside Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School during the attack. ABC's Ariel Reshef is here with the details on that. Ariel, good morning.
Good morning to you guys. Those images from inside the high school showing the moments leading up to that deadly rampage and a series of apparent security failures by police and school officials. A warning: if there are children in the room, the content here.
On February 14th, 2018, the country watched a tragedy unfold in real time. Names were reported, faces were shared, stories were told, and then, slowly, attention shifted elsewhere. What happened afterward was quieter. This story is not about the moments caught on camera, but about the years that followed. About a young man who survived a public act of violence and entered a private struggle that few people saw clearly at the time. Medical records replaced news headlines. Hospital rooms replaced classrooms. Progress appeared, then disappeared. There were diagnoses. There were interventions. There were warnings that only made sense later. By the time this case reached its conclusion, it was no longer considered breaking news. But the circumstances surrounding it raise questions that extend far beyond a single life. This is the story of what remained after survival and what was ultimately overlooked. You are welcome to our channel. If you have been watching our videos, and if you are new here, you are also welcome, and do well by hitting the subscribe button and turn on notifications bell. Like and share our video. Thanks. The case of Donovan Metaya is not a typical true crime story. There is no mystery surrounding a perpetrator, no unfolding police chase, and no courtroom drama that resolves the narrative. Instead, the case centers on what occurred after a widely reported act of mass violence, when public attention moved on and long-term consequences began to surface. Most true crime narratives focus on the moment of violence itself. This case requires a different lens. The immediate act of violence in 2018 was visible, documented, and extensively analyzed. The years that followed were not. Those years involved mental health systems, fragmented care, and gradual decline rather than sudden catastrophe. This case sits at the intersection of mass trauma, psychiatric illness, and institutional limitations. It raises questions about how survivors are supported once emergency responses end, and how long-term psychological injuries are managed outside the public eye. What many people believe they know about the Parkland shooting ends in 2018. What is rarely examined is what survival required afterward. The central question is not what happened during the attack, but what happened after the cameras left. Donovan Metaya grew up in a family environment described by relatives as structured and supportive. He was raised with parental involvement and extended family connections that provided stability through childhood and adolescence. There is no public record indicating severe instability, neglect, or chronic disruption during his early years. Socioeconomically, his background was modest but functional, with access to education, housing, and healthcare prior to 2018. Family members were engaged in his academic progress and daily life. Before adolescence, there were no indications that he lacked a support system or supervision. In school, Donovan was described as academically capable and intellectually curious. He performed adequately in his coursework and showed interest in technology and problem solving. Teachers and peers noted that he was thoughtful and reserved rather than disruptive. Socially, he maintained friendships and participated in normal peer interactions. He was not known for extreme withdrawal or behavioral issues. While he may have been introverted, this trait did not raise concerns prior to 2018. There were no documented patterns of aggression, paranoia, or detachment during this period. There is no public documentation of serious mental health diagnoses before the Parkland shooting. No schizophrenia diagnosis, no history of psychosis, and no long-term psychiatric treatment have been reported prior to that year. Like many adolescents, Donovan experienced typical stress related to school and social development. However, there is no evidence that he exhibited symptoms consistent with severe mental illness before the traumatic event. What is significant in this case is not what was present early on, but what was absent. On February 14, 2018, Donovan was a senior at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. During the shooting, he was on campus and directly exposed to the unfolding event. While he was not physically injured, he was in proximity to danger and chaos for a sustained period. His exposure involved uncertainty, lockdown conditions, and the immediate threat to life. Although he survived without visible injuries, the distinction between physical safety and psychological impact became relevant in the months that followed. After the scene was secured, Donovan was evacuated, along with other students, and reunited with family members. The first hours involved law enforcement questioning, emergency protocols, and media presence surrounding the school and community.
Be quiet, and that's all I know right now.
Have you heard anything else in terms of how many people have been hurt? Or
I have no idea. I know one guy got shot in the leg. That's all I know. I heard my teacher got shot, my 9th grade teacher, but that's all I know right now.
In the immediate aftermath, the focus was on survival, reunification, and public response. Like many survivors, Donovan was identified as physically unharmed. This categorization often influences the level of follow-up care provided. Psychological trauma does not always manifest immediately. In the days following the shooting, distress was common among students and staff. This distress was often normalized as a short-term response to an abnormal event. During this period, there was pressure, implicit or explicit, to resume normal routines. Emotional disruption was expected, but long-term consequences were not yet evident. As weeks passed, Donovan attempted to return to routine activities. Academic schedules resumed, but disruptions were common. Concentration difficulties and changes in motivation affected performance. Attendance patterns shifted. Social engagement decreased. These changes were subtle and not immediately interpreted as signs of serious illness. Over time, behavioral changes became more apparent. Reports indicate increasing confusion, paranoia, and disrupted sleep. Emotional responses flattened. Donovan began to withdraw socially, limiting communication with peers. In hindsight, some of these symptoms align with early stages of psychosis. At the time, they were difficult to distinguish from trauma-related stress or depression. Family members noticed changes but faced challenges interpreting them. Attempts were made to seek help, but determining when stress becomes illness is not straightforward. The absence of prior psychiatric history complicated decision-making. Professional help was eventually sought as symptoms escalated. Initial evaluations produced varying conclusions. Diagnoses shifted as symptoms evolved. Delays occurred due to wait times, insurance limitations, and uncertainty. Donovan was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia. The diagnosis came after observable psychotic symptoms had emerged. Medication was prescribed, introducing new variables, including side effects and adherence challenges. The diagnosis altered his self-perception and future planning. Managing symptoms became a central focus of daily life. Multiple hospitalizations followed. Admissions were often crisis-driven. triggered by acute episodes rather than sustained deterioration. Discharges occurred once immediate risk appeared reduced, creating gaps in continuity of care. Long-term psychiatric care is difficult to access. Insurance restrictions, limited inpatient beds, and fragmented outpatient services complicated treatment consistency. Initial counseling resources were available after the shooting, but long-term monitoring was limited. Once public attention declined, structured follow-up diminished. Responsibility shifted heavily onto family members who lacked legal authority to enforce treatment, despite severity of illness. Coordination of care became a constant challenge.
Despite illness, Donovan pursued technical certification. These efforts indicated periods of stability and functionality. He obtained employment and was promoted, demonstrating capability within structured environments. Outward functioning masked internal instability. Apparent progress delayed urgent intervention and reinforced assumptions that recovery was underway. In the final months of Donovan Metayer's life, several behavioral changes were later identified as warning signs. At the time, these changes were not uniformly interpreted as indicators of immediate risk. Some appeared consistent with prior fluctuations in his condition, while others were subtle enough to be dismissed as temporary setbacks. Withdrawal increased. Communication with family members became less consistent, both in frequency and clarity. Conversations that had once been routine became shorter or more fragmented. There were periods of agitation, followed by long stretches of minimal engagement. These shifts did not occur all at once, but gradually, making them harder to contextualize as a crisis. There were also disruptions in treatment adherence. Missed medical appointments occurred, sometimes due to logistical challenges and sometimes due to resistance or disengagement. Medication compliance became inconsistent, influenced by side effects, skepticism about efficacy, or difficulty maintaining routine. Each disruption in isolation did not trigger emergency intervention. In combination, they signaled increasing instability that became clearer only in hindsight. During this period, Donovan continued to have contact with medical and support institutions, though those interactions were limited and fragmented. There were no widely reported criminal proceedings or public legal actions involving him in his final months. Most institutional contact centered on mental health services. Medical interactions tended to be reactive rather than preventive. Evaluations occurred after symptoms escalated rather than during early signs of deterioration. Decisions were often based on immediate risk assessments, which can overlook longer-term patterns when imminent danger is not explicitly expressed. Shortly before his death, no large-scale intervention or sustained inpatient care was implemented. This was not due to a single decision, but rather the accumulation of missed thresholds, points at which concern existed but did not meet criteria for involuntary or intensive action. These moments represent missed opportunities for intervention, not because of negligence by a single party, but because the system relies on narrow definitions of crisis that can fail individuals whose decline is gradual rather than abrupt. Donovan Metayer died in December 2024 at the age of 26. The circumstances of his death were not publicized in detail, in keeping with standard practices surrounding privacy and suicide reporting. What is publicly confirmed is that his death was ruled a suicide. No evidence of foul play was reported. There was no indication of involvement by other parties. The determination was made through standard investigative and medical procedures. Authorities classified the death as a suicide following review. The classification did not prompt a criminal investigation beyond routine procedures. Official records reflected no ambiguity regarding the manner of death. Family members acknowledged his death through public statements that focused on context rather than specifics. They emphasized his status as a survivor of the Parkland shooting and noted the long-term mental health challenges that followed. There was no public dispute regarding the official determination. Instead, family communication centered on systemic issues and the broader conditions that shaped his final years. Public reporting included his name, age, survivor status, and cause of death. Details regarding the method, location, and precise timeline were not disclosed. Medical records remained private. This absence of detail was consistent with ethical reporting standards, but also limited public understanding of how gradual decline culminates in fatal outcomes. In statements following his death, family members emphasized continuity rather than rupture. They described his life as shaped by a trajectory that began in 2018 and unfolded over years. Their focus was not on a single moment, but on cumulative strain. They questioned whether long-term care systems adequately account for trauma-induced mental illness. They raised concerns about the gaps between diagnosis, treatment, and sustained support. Calls for reform focused on survivor aftercare and continuity of mental health services. Media coverage largely framed Donovan's death through the lens of the Parkland shooting. Headlines identified him as a survivor and linked his death to that event. This framing reinforced the narrative of delayed consequence, but often lacked depth regarding the intervening years.
Most coverage summarized his struggle rather than examining the systems involved. The long-term aftermath received less attention than the initial act of violence. Few reports detailed the mechanics of mental health care or the challenges of sustained treatment. Several questions remain unanswered. Could earlier or more consistent intervention have altered the outcome? Were warning signs present but minimized due to familiarity with fluctuation? Did institutional thresholds for action align with the realities of long-term psychiatric decline? Beyond this individual case, there is limited data on how many survivors experience similar trajectories without public documentation. Many cases may never be linked back to the original trauma in media or official records. The case highlights a category of victimhood that extends beyond immediate injury. Survivors of mass violence may experience long-term psychological consequences that evolve into chronic illness. These outcomes are less visible and less frequently tracked. Mental illness triggered or accelerated by trauma presents challenges that standard care models struggle to address. Systems designed for acute episodes often fail to manage prolonged deterioration. Accountability becomes diffuse, spread across institutions rather than located in a single failure. These cases rarely become part of traditional true crime narratives because they lack clear perpetrators and discrete events. They unfold slowly without spectacle and often end quietly. This case demonstrates that survival does not conclude a narrative of harm. The end of violence marks the beginning of a different phase, one that unfolds without cameras or public urgency. It shows how long-term consequences can persist in the absence of sustained attention, and how systems built for crisis response may falter during prolonged recovery. Forgetting survivors once headlines move on carries measurable costs. The outcome was not the result of a single failure, but of accumulated gaps. Understanding those gaps is essential to preventing similar trajectories from remaining undocumented and unaddressed.